Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's session. Many thanks for being here today with us. My name is Raoul. I'm Head of Technical Development at Regen. Regen has been working with Scottish and Southern electricity networks for the past few years on helping them to understand the future, the energy transition, and what those and how that's going to impact their electricity networks in the north of Scotland and the south of England. This work is essentially culminated in what we call the Distribution Future Energy Scenarios process, which we're going to be talking a bit about today. And we'd also essentially like to get some input from all of you into that process as we are in the depths of the analysis as we speak. So again, welcome, many thanks for being here. As everyone starts to filter in, I think a few are still sort of joining and dialing in. So we'll give it another few seconds before we get into the content. Feel free to dive into the chat function and introduce yourself, say we are dialing in from today, and who you are. And yeah, we'll move on to the bulk of the webinar in a moment. So I'll be chairing the session today. I'm joined by my colleagues in the Regen team, Joel Venn and Tamsin Lonsdale-Smith. And we also have Steve Atkins, the DSO Transition Manager from SSEN, joining us to provide some context from their side as well. So I think if we move on to the agenda for today. So today we are looking for your input, your views and your help to guide us through our scenario analysis that we're doing for SSEN's Southern Central England license area. For anybody that is expecting to be talking about projections for the north of Scotland, fear not. We also have a session where we'll be exploring that license area next Tuesday as well. So we'll have an equivalent session there for anyone who's interested in talking about north of Scotland. So in a moment, you'll hear from Steve, who will be providing some context and introduction to SSEN for the license area, and also to talk through how the DFES process sits within their wider network planning process. Then around 10:30, we will be getting into some energy technology discussions and interactive polling sessions around some of the building blocks, the technologies that we use in the scenario analysis process. And about 11:30, we'll have some time for any questions that you guys have for us about the process, about the analysis, and what you've heard today. So for those who don't know us, a little bit about Regen. So we are a not-for-profit centre of energy expertise based in Exeter and Devon. We have a mission to accelerate the transition to a net zero energy system. And we've been working with the electricity networks, SSEN and others, on DFES analysis, as we call it, since around 2015. Today, we will be using Mentimeter alongside the conference. So in a moment, it would be great if everybody could take out their smartphones, go into your browser and put in menti.com. And that will essentially take you to a box that you can see on the left here. And if you put in the event code, which is on the top there and on the screen, 85894058, that will essentially take you into the polling session, and we can continue the interactive discussions, and you'll be able to directly input into the feed of the information that we're gaining from you. So the next, as we continue with the interactive discussions, please don't dive out of Zoom. Please make sure you stay within the main session. And in terms of feeding back to us, feel free to use the chat to flag anything, any issues that you're seeing. If you've got any questions for us as we step through the different technologies, please use the Q&A function in Zoom. That you can see on the bottom of your Zoom screen. And please feel free, if any interesting questions that you see that you want to upvote, give it the thumbs up, and in the Q&A session that we have at about 11:30, we will sort of direct some of those questions to each of the leads for the sessions. So I think what we'll do is let's do a test question. So for those who've already dived into Menti, please grab your phones, punch that code in. I'll say it again, 85894058, and then you'll be into the voting sessions, and hopefully we'll see the inevitable result that dinosaurs are coolest. So yeah, hopefully it's pretty intuitive to see how you vote and how you submit your answers. And that screen on your phone will update with the question that you're currently on once you've voted. So we're getting some great results here. So we've got about 60 of us on the call, and we've got just over half coming to 40. That's great. We'll probably leave that there. So yeah, anyone who's still sort of getting onto Menti, don't worry, we've got some slides to get through before we get into the technology voting sessions. So yeah, thanks very much. It's not as clear cut as I was expecting to see, but yeah, great stuff. So I think at this point I shall hand over to Steve Atkins, the DSO and Transition Manager at SSEN that we've been working with on the DFES work. Over to you, Steve.
Okay, thanks for that, Ray. Really good to see so many people on the call today, and good to see some local authorities and community groups on there. That's great to have that interaction with you all. If we just move to the next slide, I just thought I'd give you a bit of an introduction to SSE and how SSEN fits within that, just to clarify our position. So SSE as a group has 7 business units, and you can see them there: thermal, an investment side, generation side. Transmission and distribution, which is SSEN, this is about today, and then our enterprise and energy customer solutions. We don't have a supplier arm. Some of you know that we sold that a couple of years ago. So we're focused on renewables, and particularly transmission and distribution. If we go over the page, in terms of that transmission and distribution business, we own networks, 2 license areas, one in the north, which is the Highlands and Islands of Scotland, so pretty diverse topography up there, and central southern England, which again isn't without its islands. So we have the Isle of Wight as part of that license area as well. So we own the transmission and the distribution network in our Scottish license area, and the distribution network in our southern area. And our work with Regen is focused on the distribution network, looking to do with the work that we do with Regen is to understand the impact on our network out into the future, being able to plan for that and being able to think that through. We distribute power to over 3.8 million homes and businesses, and there's going to be some significant changes over the next few years, and we want to be ready for that and accommodate that and facilitate it. Turn to the next slide, just to emphasize that net zero is going to fundamentally reshape electricity demand. So this is just some highlights from the Committee on Climate Change, which predicts an electrification of the energy network. You can see, out to 2050, the potential new electricity demands in order to meet net zero in terms of, it look fairly small bars, but this is terawatt hours per year. So just in terms of transport, in terms of heat, industry and agriculture, hydrogen electrolysis, synthetic fuels, and carbon capture and storage. And the headline is that electricity demand could increase by 2 or 3 times by 2050 from the Committee on Climate climate change, and we're well aware of that change, and we see ourselves as a facilitator for net zero. You know, it's not enough for us to be ready to meet net zero by 2050. We need to be, you know, well in advance of that, so that we can facilitate others, including yourselves, in terms of the ambitions that you have net zero by 2050. And on the next slide, this is just some of the kind of headlines that we're seeing at the moment, and some of that is some of those headlines are a reflection of the work that we've done with DFES and the insight that gives us, and others are work that you've done it yourselves in your own local authority areas, or you know, are coming out of some of the policy decisions that being made at the moment. So 70,000 electric vehicles in Oxford by 2050, 140,000 electric cars by 2050, seeing growth in the Highlands there, energy efficiency on the Isle of Wight, charging points for electric cars in Bournemouth driveways. So you can see, you can sense the kind of groundswell of urgency around some of this. And some of these are changing as other policy decisions are being made, and as we get more insight as well. So we run our DFES yearly in order to update some of these numbers and reflect recent changes and input from entities such as yourself. On the next page, we kind of demonstrate how we utilize the distribution future energy scenarios. So these regional distribution future energy scenarios, which Ray will talk a little bit more around, you know, how they're pulled together, but we use those for network constraint and heat mapping, and then off the back of that, build that into our network investment plans. And across the bottom there, you can see at all points in that, we're looking to build an evidence base through stakeholder engagement. So DFES is initially based on our pipeline activity and what we can see coming through, but certainly last year we engaged with many local authorities around their housing and development plans, their energy strategy and local energy plans, to try and sort of understand some of those aspirations and how we needed to adjust some of those based on stakeholder engagement and the evidence they were able to provide around those targets and ambitions. And part of that is for us to justify that to Ofgem. At the end of the day, Ofgem is an economic regulator. They're looking for you know, the most value from, you know, from least spend. So we, when we approach them, have to be able to put together, you know, fairly concrete evidence around future ambitions in terms of funding, in terms of ability to deliver, and being supported by you know, local and national policy. If we move on, Ray. I just wanted to illustrate, you know, the impact in terms of these studies that we do. So I thought I'd use Kwasi Kwarteng's local area just to illustrate the local impact of the transition to net zero and what that means for networks. So chosen Spelthorne here. He's seen this as well. So I'm, you know, not speaking out of school, as it were, but you can see, using two of the scenarios that are within the future energy scenarios and the distribution future energy scenarios, leading the way, which is the most aspirational scenario, and steady progression, which is a more kind of top-down scenario, and Ray will probably cover those. You can see the kind of uptake over out to 2050 on heat pumps, non-domestic gas backup, electric, domestic gas backup and electric. You can see the difference between those. If we move on to EV, domestic vehicle domestic electric vehicle uptake progressions. You can see the difference. Obviously, we're seeing that in the pipeline at the moment in terms of uptakes of EVs, and not in terms of the outturn at the end. Fairly similar position, but a more rapid uptake on leading the way. And this is again within those within the spell torn area. And then on the next page, combined, so you can see the impact on both on leading the way and steady progression, the impact on load within that area during the period. So significant impact, and I think we've got an animation that gives us an illustration of that on the next slide. As you look, these are our local substations. So on the steady progression scenario, it shows the constraints in that area as that heat pumps and EVs connect to the grid, and the impact that they will have on the existing infrastructure out to 2050. If we go to that run through the next slide, this slide is on leading the way, and as you can see, it turns red an awful lot quicker in terms of the leading the way scenario based on our existing infrastructure. So clearly a significant challenge for the distribution network, and studies such as this with Regen give us real insight into where those issues occur. If we go to the next slide, that's just running through again. So you can see within the total LV networks over our network, as it stands at the moment, from 2023 out to 2050, in 18 to up to 106 overloaded networks. In terms of leading the way, from 30 up to 193 networks. So in the do nothing scenario, from a network perspective, significant impact. So we need to understand where those pinch points are and where that's going to occur. So just in terms of my final slide, before I hand back to Ray, we see this Regen piece as a really key part of the input to our plans for the coming years. We need to accelerate progress towards a net zero world. We need to still provide a valued and trusted service for our customers, and that is by creating a safe, resilient and responsive network. And in order to do that, we need to understand where those pinch points are going to occur and how to mitigate them. And the Regen study gives us a great insight to that. Thank you.
Many thanks, Steve. Appreciate the useful context there. Obviously, if you've got any questions for Steve, he will be joining us at the Q&A panel at about 11:30. So please do put them into the Q&A function within Zoom, and yeah, we'll bring those to Steve in a little while. So what I'm going to do now is just touch a little bit on the DFES nuts and bolts before we get into the individual technologies. I see a question there from Jan. That we are going to share the slides, package those up after the session, so don't worry, those will be available for circulation afterwards. So yeah, some may have seen that we sent around a pre-read document that covers some of the basics, the fundamentals about what DFES is all about and what we wanted to get from today. I'm not going to go over them in detail, but I'm just going to give a whistle stop of some of those basics to explain and give context for why we're asking the questions that we're about to of you all. So in this session, we're going to be sort of summarizing what it is and how we do it. Then we're going to be moving on to some individual technology sessions with my colleagues. And then there's an opportunity for you to ask us about the DFES process towards the end. So as Steve said, DFES analysis is essentially about the how much, when and where of future energy technologies within the license area that we're looking at. So that forecasting process, or that scenario projection process, gives SSEN that kind of technology view of capacity or numbers of EVs how much there might be, under what scenario, in what year, and where within the license area do we foresee those technologies connecting. That is a stepping stone in a longer term process that informs a network, long-term network view, that informs an investment appraisal, that informs the business planning process that the SSEN and the other networks are currently going through. And today is a fundamental part of that process as we engage with the people who are involved in these technologies, these projects, these transitions, as to how that can inform the analysis that we are doing and applying on those scenarios. So we use the Future Energy Scenarios framework that National Grid ESO publish annually. The FES 2021 is obviously what we are using for this year's study for SSEN. People may well be familiar with it. It essentially sets and defines 4 future energy worlds between now and 2050. They have each scenario essentially has a number of technological, economic, and societal assumptions and places that we are in as a society with energy. And essentially they are done around 2 axes, one of speed of decarbonisation and one of level of societal change. So we've got leading the way, which is essentially the top right of that quadrant. And then we've got steady progression, as Steve used those examples a minute ago for Spelthorne, sort of the opposite ends of both of those axes. And then in the middle, you've got consumer and system transformation. One, essentially, they are what they say on the tin. One is more around consumer-led transitions, consumer technologies, consumers and people driving the change and decarbonisation. And system transformation is more system-oriented, so the top-down transition and decarbonisation. 3 of them, as you can see, are compliant with net zero obligations, and we are specifically reflecting in the Scotland licence area, for example, net zero by 2045. So what is an essential point here is we use these as a naming convention, some of the broad overall assumptions that define these scenarios, but we do not essentially take the national scenarios and divide them up. We build our own bottom-up, evidence-driven, project-driven projections for each technology for the license areas that we are looking at, and we take into account the very bespoke and specific geographic considerations that the southern central England and north of Scotland license areas are. So the technologies that are in scope, essentially we are looking at technologies that directly interact with the distribution electricity network. So to start with, that accounts for all of the distributed generation and storage technologies. So all the major renewables, wind, solar, hydro, marine, waste-driven generation, so biomass, AD, sewage gas, etc. Fossil fuel generation, diesel, natural gas, electricity storage technologies that we are seeing connecting to the distribution network, so predominantly batteries, but also other storage technologies, and disruptive future technologies like hydrogen electrolyzers, for example, technically not electricity generation, but they are a distributed source of electricity demand that could co-locate alongside some generation technologies. So it is a consideration out to 2050, which is the timeframe of the study, that we have to take into account. And that's a relatively new technology area that we've added within the scope. We also look at what we call low carbon technologies, so smaller scale, domestic, in some sense, scale technologies. So we have a number of different electric vehicle types, so electric cars, obviously, but also other vehicle types. We project the number of those. We also project the capacity of electric vehicle charges, and we have a number of different archetypes: on-street, off-street, destination, etc. Supermarket car parks, for example. We also look at heating technologies, so electrically fueled heating technologies, and we consider potential for hybrid heating systems as well, depending on the scenario. They may feature more or less. So direct electric heating, air source and ground source heat pumps, for example, are the major technologies for us for the SSEN study. And also domestic rooftop PV. So even though we look at large solar, we also look at domestic solar as well. We also look and engage with all of the local authorities that are within SSEN's license areas, and we have a bit of a data exchange that we do online. So anyone from the councils that are on the call today, many thanks for your input so far, and we do this annually. We look at the potential for new homes that are being built within the license areas. So we look at domestic housing developments, and we also look at known new non-domestic developments. So new colleges being built, supermarkets, etc. And we include that as projections within the study to inform SSEN of sort of base demand that is coming their way within the near to medium term. For each of those technology sectors, or those building blocks that are in scope, we essentially follow a fairly similar process. Obviously, there are some bespoke considerations when we look at heat pumps versus onshore wind, for example, but at its heart, the DFES determines a historic baseline of what has been connected up to a baseline year, which is 2020 for this year. We look at the near-term pipeline, probably the most important part of the analysis. We look at known projects that are in planning, that have an accepted connection offer with SSEN themselves, that have development evidence in markets such as the capacity market, for example. And we look at a near-term pipeline, and we define what may connect in what year based on the scenario that we are in. Beyond that pipeline, we then develop medium and long-term projections out to 2050. And this is where some of the scenario worlds that we are within essentially creates a bit of spread in terms of the potential capacity or the numbers of by 2050 for the license area. And then what we do once we have a total for the license area, we then geographically distribute these technologies or these projections, these capacities across the license area. And we do that through a process called electricity supply areas. So we essentially take the infrastructure that SSEN have, so the substations, and we define what we call ESAs, electricity supply areas. So we've used a geographic method to do this. So for the big generation and storage technologies, we do this to 11,000 volts or 11 kV substation level. And then for the low carbon, more domestic oriented technologies, we do that to low voltage, so almost feeder or secondary substation level, which is pretty much street level for some of the technologies. And that's a sort of level of granularity that reflects the fact that they're going to be a much more granular uptake. So that hopefully gives you a summary of the DFES in a nutshell. Obviously, that pre-read document that we circulated, please do continue to refer to that. And obviously, any questions you have on the broader process, happy to take them towards the end. Now, we would like to turn to you guys for some input and some insights and views on some of the technology. So we're not going to cover the whole list, don't worry. We would have to extend the length of the webinar quite a lot to cover everything. But we'd like to explore some of the key ones that you see on screen here. So we want to look at transport, EVs and EV chargers. We wanted to look at electrified heat. We want to look at some of the key renewables, onshore wind and solar. We want to look at storage, batteries and other technologies. Touch on diesel and gas, the future of fossil fuel generation in the license area, and also hydrogen electrolysis. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Joel Venn, for the, actually, no, I'm not going to do that. Before we do that, sorry, we'd like to get a bit more information about yourself and who you are, where you're coming from, and what sector you kind of have a bit of a focus on. So again, if you could take out now your smartphones, hopefully you've been able to get into menti.com with the code 85894058. And if you could just briefly fill in your information, this is really helpful for us for sort of contextualizing the analysis and the results that we're having back from you. I would say at this point, if you look at that technology list and think, well, I don't really have a view on renewable energy or electric vehicles, don't worry. We're really keen to hear from everybody. If you don't have an informed view or you just want to take a punt at one of the answers, that's absolutely fine. And obviously, if you do have a very specific view, that's also fine as well. So yeah, don't worry if you want to skip a question because you really just don't have an answer to give us. That's also fine as well. There's no pressure on anything, on anyone. We're just really interested to hear from as many people as we can to give us a broad view and a broad engagement for this year's analysis. So hopefully I can see about 35 of us have filled in. So we'll give it another 10 seconds. We're going to obviously step through a number of technologies today, and I do appreciate everybody's input as we go through. But hopefully it will be quite an interesting whistle stop of some of the key future energy technologies that we will be seeing interactive with the electricity system out to 2050. Okay, so we're up to about 40, so I think we'll leave it there. So thanks very much. If you've got some other points or anything to make a note of, obviously we've also got the Q&A that are outside of the questions that we're asking you. But I think let's get into our first technology sector. So as I said, I'm going to hand over now to my colleague Joel Venn, head analyst at Regen, who's going to take us through transport and heat. Thanks, Joel, and speak to you guys a bit later on.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to start off by talking a bit about EVs themselves and EV chargers. So while we do have a more holistic view on transport as a whole, we're just really focusing on some of the technologies that might have the most disruptive impact to the distribution network. So we're starting off with EVs on the next slide. And naturally, as part of any projections out to 2050 or any date, the starting point is to think about the situation on the ground now and think about what lessons can be learned there and how that might affect the future uptake. So we've got a few statistics here about the existing uptake of EVs and EV chargers. And we've got the GB average for comparison, and we've also got both of SSEN's license areas on here as they provide a useful comparison to compare against each other. And this tells us that for the southern license area, EV chargers, the uptake of EVs in the license area is dramatically above average. We think there are a couple of drivers for this. The southern license areas has a lot of company cars, a lot of new cars being bought, which are in the baseline a big driver of EV uptake. The area is relatively more affluent, and we see affluence as a relatively short-term driver of EV uptake. And another factor coming in there more historically and less so now is relative rurality, or how urban an area is as well. And those factors combine in the south to result in a very high uptake of EVs compared to the GB average and compared to SSEN's Scottish licence area. Then looking at chargers, we can see that the south has above average uptake of EV chargers. And the result of that is that there's relatively speaking, compared to the average, there's below average availability of EV chargers compared to the national average. And so thinking about these factors can help us think about how the uptake of EVs could play out at a local level. And obviously, certainly by some dates in the 2030s, we'd expect EVs to be relatively ubiquitous everywhere, with the different dates in there for the bans on petrol and diesel vehicles. But the approach to 2030, there's some uncertainty as to how the uptake of EVs could play out. And so our first question asks about whether you think the uptake of EVs in the southern licence area will remain ahead of the rest of the UK, or whether you think there are factors that would result in the UK catching up to the southern licence area and the southern licence area's uptake of EVs slowing down. Perhaps you think that those factors resulting in initial high uptake in the southern licence area are reaching a level of saturation, and so that initial push in EV uptake in the southern area is going to slow down, or perhaps there are reasons why EV uptake will flatten across the UK, and will much more quickly see ubiquitous uptake of EVs. Of course, there's we know of the 2030 date as the ban on the sale of petrol and diesel vehicles. There's some uncertainty as to when the ban on hybrids exactly how that might play out, and what exactly the ban will be, whether that will be for pure hybrids or plug-in hybrids. Can see quite a few answers coming in here, and generally, not wanting to sway any remaining answers, looks like participants think that the southern license area will remain ahead of the UK average, kind of a couple of peaks there at 2030 and 2035. We'll just give it a couple more seconds to come through. But I think that's slowing down now. Very helpfully, Ray has set a countdown on time, so you've just got 5 seconds to fill out. There's a question here, align with the rest of the UK. Apologies if I haven't been clear there. What I mean by that is the relative sales rate of vehicles per year, and whether the sales rate, the percentage of vehicles that are sold that are electric, will remain ahead of what that figure is across UK in the southern license area, or whether the percentage of vehicles that are sold being electric will be about the same across the rest of the UK. So next slide here, and apologise for possibly some convoluted or unfamiliar terms, but we're moving into looking at EV charging now, EV charging infrastructure. And again, looking at the baseline situation of where existing EV chargers are located, and the types of locations that they are located. And again, we've got a comparison between the north of Scotland SSEN license area and the southern SSEN license area as a comparison. The two key terms here is the level of centralization or decentralization of EV chargers. And what I mean by that, whether the types of locations that chargers are currently located are in more decentralized locations, such as on street, or in destination locations, such as pubs or shops or supermarkets, leisure and tourist facilities, places that you go that you don't intend to charge, but chargers happen to be there. And that's the situation in the southern license area, where we see more private companies installing chargers when compared to the north of Scotland license area. And these, I see a question on the chat about the difference between kilowatts in different locations, the power of the chargers in different locations. Absolutely, there is a difference. And just to clarify that, this image here looks at the number of chargers in different locations. And there is certainly differences in the power of chargers in different locations, typically seeing higher power chargers in en route locations, such as motorway service stations, when you compare to lower power chargers that are more typically in destination or workplace locations. So this here, we're focusing in on public charging infrastructure and looking at the level of centralization versus decentralization, which perhaps is the level of private versus public involvement in installing charging infrastructure. And so the next question asks about, got another slide here, just to illustrate the granularity of the projections that we're making, illustrating how the domestic projections are produced to a feeder or a street level. So there's a map here of the relative amount of off-street EV charging in Swindon. So we can see more off-street charging away from the city centre, which would imply that there'd be greater need for on-street charging towards the centre of the city. And on the right, there's a picture of public and non-domestic charging locations. Again, you can see car parks and other more centralised charging locations in the centre of the city, and granularity of different chargers spread around the area of Southampton. So the next question, which I believe is next, asks your opinion about the future of charging infrastructure in the southern licence area, and whether you think we will continue to see what's the status quo in the southern licence area and continue to see widely distributed charging, more on-street charging, more charging in distributed locations like in pubs, in supermarket car parks, in shopping centres, etc. Or at the other end of the spectrum, the situation that more exists in Scotland, where there's a lot more centralisation of charging. There's a lot more charging in publicly administered areas such as car parks. There's more charging in charging hubs, or whether it will go somewhere in the middle, which we've coined neighbourhood EV charging hubs, where you see less on-street charging and more charging in hub areas, but you still get some charging on street and some charging in more centralised locations. Thank you for your answers. Can see those ticking in. Yeah, so I can see Chris has asked about how does this compare to domestic chargers. It's a good point. Unfortunately, we haven't got all the time in the world to focus on everything. We are also considering the uptake of domestic chargers, but we see the uncertainty around what the future of public or away from home charging infrastructure could look like as a larger area of uncertainty. We would expect, most homes with availability, with a driveway in the future and an EV to install a charger at some point. But for the 40% or so of houses without the ability to charge at home, and for those who do have charging at home but go on longer journeys, where they'll charge, the kind of places that they'll charge. So I think the rate that the answers are coming back in has slowed. So thank you for your answers. I think 30 seconds is a bit long. I think we could probably move on to the next slide, please, Ray, if that's possible. And we're going to look at heat pumps next. And again, while we do have a more holistic view on heating technologies, considering the uptake of hydrogen or the uptake of biofuels, uptake of direct electric heating and other electrified technologies, we're just going to focus in on heat pumps today. And again, the first starting point is to look at the baseline. And so again, looking to compare against the GB average, we've got some statistics here on the percentage of homes that are heated by different technologies and different fuels. And relatively speaking, the SSEN, the southern SSEN license area is relatively average. It's got slightly less gas heating than average, slightly more direct electric and slightly more oil, LPG and solid fuel heating as a result of its relative rurality, but it does have a lot of urban areas, and you typically see, as the map illustrates, a greater prevalence of gas heating in more urban areas. The closer you get to London, the closer you get to the southern coast, and the urban areas along the southern coast of the licence area, the prevalence of gas heating increases, and predictably in the more rural areas, the prevalence of gas decreases. And that helps us think about the distributed location of heat pumps in the future. And again, we consider the uptake of heat pumps to approximately a street level, and knowing how those homes are currently heated and some other factors to do with those households helps us consider the scenario-based uptake of heat pumps. We'd consider that heat pumps are, particularly in the short term, more likely to be taken up in homes that are off the gas network. At least that's what's happened historically. Previously, we have seen greater uptake of heat pumps in areas that are off the gas network. But there are a number of other factors to come into that. And if we could go on to the next slide, I just got one slide here before the last question, which illustrates how that very spatial street level view affects the projections. We've got two villages here, which I think are in Wiltshire. We've got a village of Barford St Martin to the west of the village of Wilton. And these two villages have very different heating infrastructure in the baseline. Barford St Martin does not have a gas network, whereas Wilton does have a gas network. And at the moment, how that plays out in the scenarios is that we would predictably not see any hybrid gas heat pumps in Barford St Martin, whereas we do see an uptake of hybrid gas heat pumps in the short term in Wilton. But there are a number of other factors leading to the uptake of heat pumps or leading to a slower uptake of heat pumps. And so the question on the next slide asks you about your view on the relative importance of different factors affecting the uptake of heat pumps. And we know that the government has set a target of the UK installing 600,000 heat pumps per year by 2028. We know that the CCC has recommended that number be even higher. So depending on the scenario, we are expecting a large uptake of heat pumps. But where they'll be targeted in the near term is a key question. And so there are a number of different locations, spatial locations and situations that we've put here, including, I've mentioned the relative, the proportion of homes that are heated by gas or heated by other fuels, but also the number of, the amount of social housing and whether we expect to see social housing providers increasingly obligated or incentivized to providing low carbon heating, the extent to which we expect to see heat pumps in new build housing, and the extent to which we expect fuel poverty to be a factor, and perhaps whether homes in fuel poverty will be prioritized for energy efficiency and heat pumps. So thank you for your answers coming in so far. Interesting to see, and we have historically agreed with the fact that new build housing would be a really key, important factor for the uptake of heat pumps. In our new build projections, we do include assumptions as to the number of new build houses that are heated by heat pumps versus other technologies. And again, interesting to see you agree that you think off-gas households will remain a key factor for the uptake of heat pumps, and even those with electric heating, radiant electric heating will still have a sort of higher than average, higher than the standard 2.5 middle value there. So you think electric heating does have a role in being replaced by heat pumps, just a little. Great, so I think those answers are slowing down now, so I think I'll draw that to a close. Thank you very much for your input there. We'll take those answers away and consider them in our projections.
Thanks very much, Joel, and thanks everybody for diving in on the voting for EVs and EV chargers. They're really useful insights for our analysis this year. We're going to move on to almost opposite ends of the spectrum scale-wise now to look at some renewable energy generation technologies connecting to the distribution network. And I'd like to introduce my colleague, Tamsin Lonsdale-Smith, energy analyst here at Regen, who's going to be guiding you through the next section. Over to you, Tamsin.
Hi, Thank you very much, Ray, for that introduction, and thank you everybody for all of your engagement so far. We know that your input into our analysis is super invaluable, and we are just looking to continually improve the way that we look at our distribution future energy scenarios methodology. So thank you for all of your engagement on heat and transport so far. As Ray said, I'm going to be moving on to our larger generation technologies, specifically wind, onshore wind, and heat. And solar PV. So I'll begin with two questions on onshore wind. My two questions are centered around what is the status of onshore wind development currently in the Southern License Area, and how important do we think that co-location of storage is going to be for enabling future onshore wind development in the area. Here we can see a short time series of onshore wind connection in Great Britain from 2005 to 2020. We've seen enormous growth in the northern areas of Great Britain, specifically around that borderland area in the north of England and the south of Scotland. So you can see that also in that southern license area of SSEN, we don't see very much adoption. Within the SSEN network area, we have about 25% of all of the available unconstrained wind resource in Great Britain. By unconstrained, I mean there's good wind speeds, but there's also not an area of outstanding natural beauty or a bioreserve nearby, so that land could be theoretically and feasibly used for wind generation. However, of the total unconstrained wind resource in the southern license area, only 2.5% of all of that unconstrained resource in Great Britain is represented and distributed within that southern license area. So that can partially explain why we're not seeing a huge onshore wind uptake up until now. And here we see a map of both the baseline and pipeline sites of onshore wind in the southern license area. Uptake of wind has been relatively scarce, and we've seen very little happen in the past few years. This may be due to antagonistic local planning and limited national level support. I could highlight the case of the Purbeck or Alaska wind farm site, which has been fraught with planning issues in the past few years. I'm sure many of you on the call today will have a bit more intel on that site particularly. So due to this poor planning engagement and very little pipeline analysis, as you can see here on the right, we have the projections from our 2020 analysis. And we see that there's very little uptake in the near term for onshore wind in this license area. But as we move to our medium term and longer term projections, we see some uptake. And we've tried to reflect this with a range of potential outcomes, with leading the way coming out on top, getting to nearly 300 megawatts by 2050. Consumer transformation making that 300 megawatts by 2050 and leading the way reaching around 230 megawatts. So I'd like to just jump into our first question then. With all of this context in mind and what I've laid out in front of you, where do you see onshore wind going in the future? Is it going to flatline along the current trends and not change very much? Is it going to grow slowly, but perhaps not as dramatically as in our most ambitious scenario projections from the previous slide that I've just shown, due to some improved planning friendliness in certain areas, but maybe not across the license area? And if you have any other sort of knowledge on local planning authorities and regimes within the license area, please feel free to drop that in the chat or message us later. Or do you think the third option, that our most ambitious scenarios from the 2020 analysis are realistic and that we can see massive growth into the 2030s and 2050s in the long run? I'm just going to put a 10-second timer so you've got a little bit more time. Looks like we've got pretty good engagement so far on this question. Great, thank you very much. I'd now like to move on to the second question on onshore wind. So this is on the role of storage in unlocking wind energy as a whole. For this question, try not to think just about this license area, but in Great Britain and the wind energy at large. So how important do you think storage is going to be in unlocking onshore wind generation? Perhaps it's not very important, and we can rely more on the flexibility and smart grid solutions to ensure that wind is highly dispatchable. Perhaps it is very important and that intermittent supply can be made available at off-peak hours using co-located storage. Perhaps you have some other ideas as to why storage may or may not be important in onshore wind in the future. Feel free to leave that in the chat as well. Now we've got 10 more seconds to answer this question. Wonderful. All right. Now I'm going to be moving on to large-scale solar PV in the Southern License Area. This is a massive technology for this area, so I'm going to be spending a bit more time on it. We've got 4 questions. The first question is on the status and general trends of solar uptake in the area. The second question is on peak growth for various different solar business models. Then I've got a question on the distribution factors that we use in our analysis and how you think these play a role and how they should be weighted. And finally, we've got a question on the emerging solar technologies and how that can be worked into our repowering side of the model. Here I've prepared a couple of maps of the baseline and pipeline of solar resource in the Southern License Area. As you can see, there's already quite a lot. This can be an indicator for a good future for solar technology in the area due to such a strong presence of the technology and reduced costs. However, it could also mean that we might be exhausting the resource and available land in the future. So this could be going in a lot of different ways. Try to keep those in mind. But what we do know is that in the immediate future, we've got a very strong pipeline of solar waiting to connect. This pipeline has grown immensely since the previous analysis that we did in 2020. So as of 2021, we have a total of 3.2 gigawatts in the south that have either a connection agreement or have been issued a quote. And this represents a total of 159 different sites. Approximately 2.3 gigawatts of these pipeline sites have a connection offer. Here, I just wanted to show how rapid the uptake has been. Since 2011, there were only around 41 megawatts of distributed connected sites, and none of these being below 1 megawatt that were directly connected to the distribution grid. This is not counting any sort of behind the meter solar PV on rooftops and residential properties. However, you can see that massive growth going into 2021, reaching around 2 gigawatts of sites. And here are our projections from 2020 with a comparison to the FES projections. So you can see that they're pretty well aligned. And out into 2050, under the leading the way scenario, we have as much as 8.7 gigawatts connecting by 2050. But under the consumer transformation, you can see that this is limited to around 6 gigawatts. And we have the steady progression trend. Looking at the most recent years, there hasn't been much growth, so we see that not actually growing as quickly in the future under that steady progression scenario. Again, here we're trying to reflect a range of different outcomes based on various scenario frameworks. So on to our first solar question. How do you see solar deployment going in the future in the south of England? Is the trend going to pick up again with exponential growth in the near term, reflecting the highest interest of this high interest of pipeline sites that I was speaking about before? Or the second option, do we see projects continuing the current trend, tapering off perhaps in the near term with more growth sort of pushed out into the long term? Or do we see levels staying pretty much where they are today, having that initial growth sort of stay where it is now and grow just steadily out to 2050, similar to that steady progression scenario? I'll give you a few seconds to think about that. Great. Thank you very much for your engagement on this question. I'll jump right into the next one. So when do you see the most growth occurring in each of the following business models? Here I wanted to get your idea on the different scales of solar. So small scale, less than 1 megawatt. Do you see that peaking at around, and I'm talking about the growth, so the the rapidness of the uptake of each of these technologies, these business models. So less than 1 megawatt, maybe it's going to be coming on more quickly in 2025, maybe closer to 2050. Is this a near-term, mid-term, or a long-term growth? Equally for large-scale distributed solar, do you see that growing more quickly in the mid-term, the medium-term, or the long-term? And finally, for that transmission scale that will be emitted from our analysis, since we're concentrated here on the distribution level analysis, for that large-scale solar, do you see that growing more rapidly in the near-term, the mid-term, or the late-term? Great, we're getting a lot of engagement on this question. Thank you so much. I'm going to put a timer for 10 seconds. Wonderful. Thank you so much for engaging this far. All right, I've got one more explainer slide before our next question. So as part of our analysis, we are distributing the uptake of solar in our projections into various different electricity supply areas, so various different regions within the license area. And in order to determine where that solar is likely to be located, we use a set of distribution factors. So here I've presented a non-exhaustive example of the distribution factors that we might use. So maybe a local authority in the area has declared a climate emergency or has very ambitious renewable energy targets. We'll factor this into our analysis. We'll also look at various planning friendliness. Have projects in the area historically gone through? Have they been rejected? Have they gone to appeal and then gone through? So all of this will factor into whether or not we think there's a friendly planning environment in that location. And finally, we have an in-house Regen resource assessment, which takes into account solar irradiance, as well as those areas where it's unlikely that planning permission is going to be given to a project due to bioreserves, or if it's on a particularly sensitive site that is not suitable to solar development. So keeping these in mind, I would really like to get your opinion on what you think is the most important factor. We would really like to have your input here in order to understand if our weightings are correct. I'd like to use this as a bit of a sense check to see whether or not you think these factors are important in your view, or if you have any other factors that you think we might not be taking into account that we should be including in our analysis, please feel free to have a chat with us. Drop it in the chat box and we'll reevaluate and revisit. We've got Johnny in the chat saying grid is probably the key factor. So yes, that is something that we take into account in our resource analysis. We look at proximity to the grid as well in order to reflect this. We've got another one saying grid is a key factor. So again, that is incorporated into our analysis. Alrighty, I'm just going to be putting on a timer. So you've got 10 more seconds to answer this question. Wonderful, thank you so much. All right, last slide before the last question on solar, and then we'll be moving on to some other flexibility technologies, and Ray will take the handle for me again. So now I just wanted to talk very briefly about our repowering model. I don't believe we've spoken about this much in previous engagement events. So one aspect of the model that you may or may not be aware of is looking at existing solar sites and understanding how in the future these might be repowered at the end of life to increase the efficiency at that particular site. Here we're looking at the difference in efficiencies of various solar panels, such as monocrystalline or polycrystalline, those first gen panels that have a certain level of efficiency, and then you can have more advanced technologies becoming more cost competitive in the market and taking that stance, such as concentrated PV cells, which can have solar tracking and greatly improve the efficiency of a solar site. The way that we have incorporated this in the past, you can see here that I've put our percent increase for various different scenarios in order to try and account for that variability in repowering. And if we move on to the next question, I'd like to get your opinion. Based on these emerging technologies in the market, what is the maximum increase in repowering of pre-existing solar panels? Feel free to answer this one, even if you are not a solar expert. We're really interested in getting all inputs here, but equally, if you would like to abstain, that is also okay. Okay, I'm going to be putting a timer for 10 seconds here. Looks like we've got a range of answers, so quite a few different opinions on this one. Alrighty, I think that's all from me. Thank you very much, and we can now move on to energy flexibility side of this engagement.
Thanks very much, Tamsin. Appreciate your input again on renewable energy technologies, some interesting areas there. And yeah, the significance of solar in the region is quite prominent in the analysis, as it always is for the Southern Licence area. So the last bank of technologies, you're back with myself. So we want to talk about energy flexibility. So flexibility technologies and fossil fuel generation as well, connecting to the distribution network. So we're going to cover electricity storage, focusing on gas peaking generation, and hydrogen electrolysis. So if we start off with storage, we're going to touch a bit on battery storage, as we're seeing as a dominant technology connecting at distribution levels, the business models that we classify storage for the analysis for a bit of context. And I also would like to touch on other electricity storage technologies that we foresee interacting with SSEN's network out to the future. So I guess to start with, we categorize storage into 4 business models, focusing on, the significant pipeline and awareness of battery storage predominantly, but similarly, some of these models can be applied to other technologies as well. So we categorize projects as either standalone, so the kind of shipping crate storage facilities in the field, or other technologies that are standalone storage projects. Typically multiple megawatt scale, providing system balancing service, response and reserve services to the system as a standalone asset. Then we have generation co-location, which essentially sees storage, as Tamsin touched on, the potential to co-locate or cooperate potentially even with adjacent renewable energy, or potentially fossil fuel, as we are seeing for a handful of sites, but mostly renewable energy generation technologies and sites, either retrofitting existing plants or having a hybrid connection project connecting as new. Then we've got co-location with large energy users. So typically sort of smaller, but still sort of low megawatt, hundreds of kilowatt potentially scale projects located on site behind the meter with large energy user sites to support on-site energy management and other potential uses that they can have for a storage facility within their consumption on site. And then lastly, we look at the small domestic scale storage, so the home battery market essentially. So this is typically 5 to 20 scale batteries, depending on the timeline, installed in homes, sometimes or usually alongside rooftop PV, to provide short duration backup services as well, and divert some of that solar PV inside. So this is electricity storage that is a source of electricity demand and then electricity generation as an export that we look at. So you might be interested to see that V2G is not included in this. That's a separate consideration that we are looking to include in our EV modeling, potentially for next year. We haven't looked at it specifically exclusively this year, but we are mindful of that as a separate area, and we will be considering how to feature V2G in the study in the future. And it's probably fair to sort of summarize the unit of projection. can see a comment in the chat from Amanda there, is installed power capacity. We're very aware that the energy storage capacity in kilowatt hours or megawatt hours, or the hours of duration that you can sustain that power output, if you want to put it a different way, is not something that we project separately. The focus of the analysis is the power capacity, the connection agreement that those projects would sign with SSEN. And then there's the next stage of the process beyond that, the SSEN model, is to look at the behavior, the profiles, and therefore the energy storage capacity is taken into consideration in that next stage. So a bit of a snapshot of the baseline and known pipeline. Very interesting electricity storage. We've got 6 small-scale batteries co-located with solar farms or high-energy users, installed and operating today in the southern license area, totaling 6 megawatts. But if you look to the pipeline, it's significant in the license area. So we have 104 projects that have accepted connection offers with SSEN, and that totals just over 2.5 gigawatts. They are all batteries, and they range in size from single megawatts up to 100 megawatts. And they're a mixture of models, so some are co-locating, some are standalone. And from our initial analysis, a significant number, potentially up to a gigawatt of this 2.5 gigawatts, has positive development evidence. So they have planning approval, or they are active and successfully pre-qualifying in recent capacity market auctions. We're mindful that there are other markets that storage assets are going for, but in terms of a snapshot of available data that we have for individual projects that we can search and look for and research, we turn to the capacity market and planning as a sort of first cut. So a question we have is those business models that we talked about for battery storage, projects that we're seeing in that pipeline and that maybe future out to 2050. What do you see, or what do you think will see the most connected capacity in the license area by 2050? Is it going to be a continuation of these standalone large-scale megawatt projects, potentially expanding their storage capacities, but still kicking out significant amounts of power output? So is the standalone where all the investment and capacity is going to be? Or are we going to see a shift to sort of meeting head-on that significant amount of solar that we're seeing in the license area? So is a large amount of it going to co-locate with solar and actually dwarf or overtake the standalone market? And potentially wind as well, if we see some connection happening. Is actually, a transition, the energy transition and the focus on decarbonisation of consumption and demand, are we going to see that move towards energy users co-locating storage on site to focus their energy management? Or are we going to see a massive uptake in the domestic sector? Are you going to be able to buy a home battery from B&Q and install it in your home with an electrician and certify it with the network? So interesting to see. We've got a clear sort of large scale focus. So the co-location is coming out on top as what we're going to see, which is probably reflective of our initial views as well, with significant renewable energy generation that we're seeing in the license area. So we'll leave that one there. We've hit 40, brilliant. Many thanks for your input. So I want to sort of talk about, obviously batteries are the dominant technology today, standalone. So batteries and also solid state batteries, predominantly lithium ion, but there are other technologies and other chemistries available, obviously. Those are where we're seeing all the development evidence at the minute, but we also want to consider other technologies, electricity storage technologies that could connect to the distribution network. So we've engaged some representatives of the liquid air storage sector. We've also looked at pumped hydro, perhaps more for the Scotland license area than the south, but we do consider it. Flow state batteries, the work that Regen does with the electricity storage network is seeing that the interest in flow state batteries, or other technologies that we're seeing, such as flywheels. So a question would be, what other non-battery technologies might we see connecting at distribution network level in the Southern England license area by 2050? Do we see, a complementary set of technologies happening alongside batteries? I think battery storage will continue to connect with that pipeline that we've seen there. But other technologies are developing all the time, moving beyond trials and pre-commercial demonstrators into commercial scale projects, and taking on longer duration services, providing different offerings to the network that maybe short to medium duration batteries can provide. So where do we see some of those technologies going? Really interesting to see flow batteries potentially taking on some of the roles as well, and liquid air also coming into play. I think we'll give that another 5 seconds or so. Obviously, as I said earlier, if you don't have a view on this, we totally understand. This is quite a sort of specialist technology area, but we'll welcome any views from anyone, your gut feel even from your experience in the energy sector. Okay, I think we will move on from that one. So I want to touch on fossil fuel generation. So we want to talk about diesel and natural gas, so methane fired fossil gas generation. So starting with diesel, so we look at obviously the fossil fuel generation technologies that connect to and interact with the network. So for diesel, this means standalone commercial scale diesel sites, so diesel power generation sites, and backup generators located on site with large energy users that can export to the network. There are a tranche of diesel generators that are sort of mains failure only, that do not have a synchronization to the network and cannot export to the network. So that isn't really within our analysis. We're only interested in sites that can essentially parallel generation to the network. But there are some backup generators that can do this in the analysis that we have. On fossil gas generation, we look at different types. So gas turbines, closed and open cycle. We look at gas reciprocating engines, so commercial scale gas generation power plants. And we also look at gas combined heat and power sites, so gas CHPs that are co-located on sites that need power and potentially on-site heat as well. There's some broad policy considerations here. To sort of fossil fuel emitting unabated fossil fuel generation is at odds with our net zero targets. The EU directive, the medium combustion plant directive, passed into UK law through air quality and emissions and environmental permitting, does restrict diesel very specifically, and also the relatively recent declaration around the fully decarbonised electricity system by 2035 has a material effect on unabated diesel and gas generation. So the picture, as we start with, is on diesel. We have 27 sites, 170 megawatts, and there's a mixture of standalone plants and some of those backup sites that can export. There is a pipeline, interestingly, in the southern license area, 26 projects, 89 megawatts, mostly new or replacement or additional backup generators. So they may have a specific role to provide support for sites that need backup power if they lose mains. On the fossil gas side, there's about 0.5 gigawatt, so 500 megawatts. This is a mixture of a couple of large OCGT sites, mostly otherwise reciprocating engines and a few CHPs. We have 67 new sites, a potential for 132 megawatts, most of which are reciprocating engines. So I guess a question we have, and you can see some of those sites sort of broken out for the map there. They were overlaid, so you can see a lot of them are obviously located around areas where there is occupied and business location, industrial areas as well. So yeah, what we'd like to ask is, firstly, with unabated diesel being at odds with those policies and at net zero generally, what do you see potentially taking on the role of diesel generation, specifically the backup generation? Because I think a lot of policies, so the MCPD probably deals with commercial scale standalone diesel, but what about backup generation? What might take its place? Is it going to be bioenergy, so biofuels and biomass potentially on site to provide that. Is battery storage or other storage technologies going to take on the role if we expand longer duration to provide longer outputs? Is diesel going to carry on, but is exhaust abatement technologies going to save the day for some reason for diesel? Is diesel going to continue operating? Hydrogen fuel cells could be an alternative as a backup on-site technology if we can scale it appropriately. Or is it actually going to be none of these things? Is it going to be something else? And feel free to dive into the chat function with any thoughts on any missing technologies that we might have missed on that. So I think we'll move on from that one. Looks like long duration storage and hydrogen fuel cells are going to take on the role of backup operation on site. We really appreciate your views on this. And if there are any businesses looking at these very assets that they have on site right now, we'd love to have a chat with you about that within the license area. Please do get in touch. Okay, fossil gas generation. So we have a pipeline of gas peaking plants looking to connect to potentially continue to operate, as well as the existing baseline. So what do you think is going to happen with fossil gas generation in the license area? Are our net zero obligations and the issues we've had and realization of gas pricing going to prevent new sites from connecting beyond the next 5 years? So is 2025 going to be the stopping point? And are we going to see a decline and a backing away of gas generation? Is there going to be a significant surge of interest? So we're seeing pipelines in not just the southern license area, we're seeing it elsewhere as well for sort of distributed peaking plants. But beyond the 2020s, are we going to see a steady decline from 2030 onwards, maybe to 2035 for that net zero electricity system declaration? Or do you think we're going to see ongoing deployment of these gas generation sites, to 2035 or beyond, or essentially until it's not permitted to operate anymore legally or operationally? So it looks like we're going to see some continued deployment out to 2035 from views held in the room. It's obviously going to be something that we will be engaging developers about specifically. We'll be looking at some of the companies that are looking to connect these sites, what their future views are, what their plans are, whether they may be diversifying their technologies once they've got their site plans up and running. I think we'll leave that one there. Many thanks for your views. Obviously, any other thoughts, please do drop a note in the chat or get in touch with us after the call. So the last area we want to touch on is hydrogen. So obviously for the scope of the DFES, we want to focus on green hydrogen production, so hydrogen electrolysis as a technology that we model. But I guess a bit of context is that low carbon hydrogen could play a role in decarbonisation as essentially a new fuel sector. There's considerations about how it's produced, how it's stored, how it's delivered, and where it's used in terms of a number of different end user sectors. And nationally, the strategy for this, there's a lot of there is some policy direction that is starting to come around the consultations that we had around the hydrogen strategy from BEIS. But the fact that we're still at consultation stage sort of sees that remains fairly unclear across the whole country. Some areas may be different to others, which makes DFES analysis looking at an individual region quite an interesting consideration. So electrolytic hydrogen, or green hydrogen as it's also known, could be a significant source in some scenarios of demand on the electricity network out to 2050. As the FES nationally projects this, there could be gigawatts of hydrogen electrolysis connecting at distribution voltages. And there's also a national target of 5 gigawatts of low carbon production capacity by 2030. What proportion of that will be electrolysis on the distribution network is also something that we consider. And as I said, there are multiple end user sectors that could see and make use of low carbon hydrogen. These include decarbonising existing hydrogen manufacturing. So we produce hydrogen, or grey hydrogen as it's sometimes known, as an ingredient, as a use for some industries. So could we see electrolyzers decarbonising those in the licence area or elsewhere already. A number of transport sector applications have been identified, so heavy road vehicles, marine and shipping, which is an interesting consideration for the ports, Portsmouth and Southampton in the licence area, and obviously to the Isle of Wight as well, some of the public shipping as well as the industrial and commercial shipping, and other transport sectors such as rail and aviation. Is hydrogen a potential fuel that we could see use for in the licence area? High temperature industrial processes, could we see electrolysis providing that within the licence area? Power generation, so could we see some of those gas peaking plants converting to become hydrogen fueled generators? And obviously the potential for space heating in homes and businesses, hydrogen boilers, hydrogen hybrid heating systems is also a consideration in the scenarios. So I'm going to leave you a bit of time for this question, so fear not. But how would you rank the potential uses for hydrogen, specifically in the Southern England licence area? So your knowledge as stakeholders and actors operating and potentially even living in the licence area, how do you see hydrogen as a potential future use? Where do you see it being focused? So is it, let's run down them again. Is it around industrial processes, decarbonising and focusing in on industrial estates? Is it going to be around the ports and shipping areas where hydrogen will be needed as a demand area? Is it going to be actually a potential for road vehicles, so road transport, HGV fueling stations, bus depots? Could we see electrolyzers locating or demand for hydrogen being seen there? Is it going to be to decarbonise some of our rail network? So electrification is obviously a prominent solution for that, away from diesel trains, but could hydrogen also be in the mix for some parts of our rail network? Or is it going to be around taking on the role of natural gas generation? Or are we going to see a heavy use of hydrogen for heating our homes and businesses? I realise this is quite an in-depth question. And again, I know there's not a whole room full of hydrogen experts on the call, myself included, but we would really appreciate views, your gut feels, experience and insights that you've had from conversations that you have had in your own areas. Because what we would like to sort of use this information for is identifying where we think some of those electrolysis sites could be focused around. So if on, regionally specific or local generation of production of hydrogen could meet demand areas rather than storing and transporting it great distances, could we see, where will it be co-located? So I think I'll give that 5 more seconds because we're coming up to nearly 40 responses. Thanks very much for your views and inputs, and we shall move on. Last question, I believe. Thanks for your time on all of the polls. Hopefully it's been interesting. So the last question is around generally the production of green hydrogen in the southern licence area, with lots of solar, the urban-rural split that you've seen on the maps, the other technologies that Tamsin and Joel and I have spoken about. Do you think this licence area has a strong opportunity, a regional opportunity for green hydrogen production, and therefore electrolysis connecting to SSEN's network by 2050? Or actually, do you think that those developers and those installers will be going elsewhere in the country to connect there and build out their electrolysis projects? We're kind of slightly swaying more towards maybe it's a strong opportunity compared to some other license areas. Maybe that's linked to the significant renewable electricity generation. Or maybe you're aware of some potential use cases for hydrogen that we need electrolysis to do alongside other methods of production. I think we are bang on 11:30 and we've got sort of 35 responses on that. So people, you can put your your phones down, your voting fingers down. Thanks for engaging with us on all of those areas, and your input will be very useful for us. So we're now going to have a chance for you guys to ask us some questions. So a number of questions have come in. So I'd like to invite back my colleagues, Joel and Tamsin and Steve Atkins from SSEN. Obviously, if there are some that we haven't had a chance to respond to today, we'll make sure that we can address those after the fact. But let's get into it. So Steve, I think I'll come to you first. So a number of those technologies are talking about demand, so EVs and heat and possibly electrolysis as well. In general, how is SSEN positioning to meet these demand increases?
Yeah, I mean, I think within the D phase, it gives us great insight into how demand's going to increase. As part of our plans for our next price control period, which we're finalising at the moment, we're including the D phase in terms of its picture of demand on our plans for network build and infrastructure. So we've used the community transformation scenario in general for our plans on that side. But it's not just network build as well. I mean, some of the chat, I've been monitoring the chat, and people have been talking about obviously flexibility, demand side response, demand side management. All of those areas are going to contribute to that. So as a network, part of our plans are to facilitate that as well, so we can see more services being provided to the DNO in terms of flexibility, making sure we've got cost-effective solutions for this demand, and also peer-to-peer transactions as well. We'll see as we go forward, we'll see a lot more trading of energy and capacity between third parties, which the DNO won't be participating in, but they need to facilitate. So one of the things that we're conscious of as a network operator, we need to be a neutral facilitator of these markets, both DSO services and peer-to-peer transactions. So that mix of network build, DSO services and peer-to-peer transactions are going to be key to accommodating this demand growth.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Hopefully, Joy, that's answered your question. So Joel, I'd like to come to you. So talking about EV charging infrastructure, we did touch on the difference between domestic and non-domestic. But do you see scope in the analysis that we're doing for expanded use of domestic scale charge point sharing, such as the types being pioneered by Co-Charger? Is that something that we consider in our analysis?
I don't think that we've taken a specific view on it within the scenarios. I think it's an interesting question, of course. Achieving greater utilization of domestic assets might result in less infrastructure required elsewhere, so might reduce costs elsewhere. So it's important and interesting thought. But we haven't taken a specific view on that ourselves. I would hope that it does increase. Of course, that does happen to a small extent at the moment. But yeah, I think there might need to be something that we consider whether it would affect our projections or not. Good question.
Thanks, Joel. Steve, just link to that back to you. So SP Energy Networks are proposing to become an EV charge point provider of last resort, where there isn't a viable commercial business case for a commercial provider to deploy in some areas, i.e. levels of high fuel poverty, for example. Do you see SSEN taking a similar approach?
Probably not, and the reason for that, referring back to my last answer, is that as a network, we are a natural monopoly. We need to be mindful of that, and we need to ensure that we don't distort the market in some of the actions that we take. Having said that, a coordinated rollout of EV chargers absolutely key. And I think that's one of the issues that we kind of see on the EV side, is that if it's purely left to the market, then it supports the middle classes, and it doesn't kind of facilitate some of the other areas of society. So I would encourage local authorities to get involved in some of that, and I think it would be great to see funding for that, that type of approach, so we can actually see a strong, coordinated rollout of EV chargers that supports the transport network and society, including both, like I say, the middle classes and vulnerable customers as well, as we move to increasing use of EVs.
Thanks, Steve. Tamsin, I'll come to you in regards to the solar analysis. So essentially, there's a question that's come in around how we determine the SSEN South's proportion of national solar, I guess, today and also in our projections. Could you sort of touch on how we allow for what is regional in the South versus the rest of the UK projections?
Sure, thanks very much for that question. I think this really touches on the slide that I had on our distribution factor analysis. So again, how we determine where that solar is likely to go within the southern resource area is very much determined by the resource that is available, that unconstrained resource. So that comes from an internal resource assessment that Regen conducts based on many different geographical factors and constraints. We then take that and a combination of other factors such as planning friendliness and whether or not various local authorities within that license area have declared an emergency or have ambitious renewable energy targets. And that will help us determine where the weighting should be within that resource, within that geographical area as a whole. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Tamsin. A question from Cara about, have heat batteries been included? The answer is probably no. So the technologies that we look for electricity storage is essentially electricity storage that has an electricity demand or export connection agreement. That's the direct interaction with the network. It's probably something that we should consider and talk about in our sort of narrative. And maybe it's something that we can talk with SSEN about in moving forward for future iterations of the analysis. But I think definitely something for myself, who leads the storage analysis, to make a note of. But it's not a technology building block in the DFES today as it stands, but it's something that we'll definitely take away and consider whether we need to feature it in. So there's a question from Alison. So this one relates to the potential for projects connecting in the near term. So there's a huge appetite from investors to develop new renewable energy projects. However, it is becoming increasingly difficult to find a suitable site for a project that has grid capacity available. Continually, grid offers are being issued with huge network reinforcement costs, which kill off projects. Is there any investment plan for the network which will make capacity available soon to allow new project development? Steve, I'm happy to contribute to this as well, but did you want to take that one initially, and I'll add some thoughts as well?
Yeah, I mean, in the past, to date, Ofgem are really keen for us to make sure that we don't have a situation where we get stranded assets. So we haven't been able to invest ahead of need. That we only kind of build the network when we have a firm connection that we apply. I mean, those things are going to change in the near future. Within the next price control, Ofgem are allowing for more strategic investment. We can see if there's a definite need for grid development, then we can progress that in conjunction with partners, and that inevitably that will be local authority partners, I think. And in terms of the changes to the significant code review for charges around duos and connections, and how reinforcement is applied as well. There's going to be some key changes there, so the reinforcement burden for connected generation will reduce, which may well encourage applications as well. So there's a couple of areas that are changing. I mean, to date, like I say, we aren't able to kind of invest ahead of need because of the regulatory regime. But that shift in the next price control may well see the grid open up in terms of capacity and the way that's funded in terms of the kind of reinforcement burden being shared or spread more widely as well.
Thanks, Steve. I think maybe just to add to that, from the DFES analysis perspective, which I guess goes beyond sites that are directly on the register today, we obviously project out to long term and medium term, and we do consider sites, or we are looking at sites that have had historic interaction as well in some areas, to see if we can essentially earmark that area as the potential for new project capacity that we project and then geographically distribute, that I showed on screen earlier. That essentially is taken into account in the near and medium term analysis that we do for the 4 scenarios, because we do have 4 scenarios that we model, and obviously current today grid capacity doesn't directly influence those 4 scenarios. They are different future places to be. So yeah, hopefully those projects are essentially subsumed into our projection method in some of the areas, identifying where there is interest to connect, whether it's solar resource assessment based or whether there are other reasons for it to locate itself there. Hopefully that answers your questions. So there's a question about 3-phase capacity or 3-phase supplies to domestic customers from Andrew Larkins. Steve, are SSEN planning for a wide scale rollout of 3-phase on the domestic scale?
Not a wide scale rollout. There is work in terms of looking at 3-phase supplies and how that can be utilised. There's certainly, in terms of some of the network monitoring that we're doing at the moment, we're trying to establish exactly within the road, which households are connected to which phase, so we can have a clearer visibility of that. Because in the past there was no need to know in that sense, because houses weren't using anywhere near their capacity. But certainly, I think going forward, 3-phase will be more and more significant and utilised more widely, and particularly in new developments where we're allowing for things like heat pumps and EV chargers, as right at the outset. 3-phase is going to be a solution in those developments.
Thanks, Steve. So there's a question about diesel generation that has come in. So are you not expecting diesel generation to effectively be banned at some point relatively soon? Certainly inside the potential life cycle of any kit being deployed now. I think the short answer is to that, yes. If you were to look at the projections that we produced last year, network interacting diesel disappeared in 3 out of the 4 scenarios very, very quickly. And that reflects, as I said, the medium combustion plant directive being passed into UK law, which prevents diesel or unabated diesel from operating for a certain number of hours per year. So essentially focuses in on backup generation. And I think even that, as we sort of get more and more serious about net zero electricity system 2035 and net zero targets generally, and individual areas start to look at their air quality and things like that, then I think, yeah, diesel generation as a rule will start to disappear from the system and become a legacy technology. So it's, which is why we asked, what do we think is going to take that role on? Because there will be sites, important strategic key sites, hospitals, universities, other premises, water treatment facilities that will need backup generation. So, we would love to hear from anyone on the call who is looking at their own on-site backup generation what is a low carbon view of that going to look like? So yeah, I totally agree that we do think that diesel will disappear, and hopefully that's reflected in the analysis already that we've done and will be reflected this year as well. So I think there are a few more questions, so we're doing right for time. We've got about 10-15 minutes left. So there's a question from Johnny Gowdy. If the actual growth increases above the forecast or the baseline that we're seeing, a question about how quickly SSEN and other networks can respond, and how will you convince the regulator Ofgem to approve new investment more rapidly?
I think that's a really good question. I mean, within the scenarios, we take, as I said, we take the community transformation scenario as our kind of core scenario, which is fairly rapid uptake, but we do build in contingency either side of that scenario to see other outturns, and even the kind of system transformation outturn. There is significant growth in key technology areas as well. So we need to be mindful of the possibility that it doesn't pan out as the community transformation scenario says, and the impact of the area. Within the business plan, we're building in uncertainty mechanisms for that eventuality. So a key part of that would be right at the outset to frame with Ofgem a trigger, if you like, to allow for rapid growth in a particular area. So if EVs and heat pumps come online significantly quicker than even the community transformation scenario says, it automatically kicks in additional funding to allow for that changes to accommodate that. So that's the key aspect for allowing for that. But at the same time, just to emphasize that it's not just about network build. So a lot of the work that we're doing in our innovation area is around what areas of flexibility can we utilize to accommodate that as well, and that can range from demand side response, vehicle to grid, all of those things. Maybe time charging, as we see suppliers introduce, we're already seeing them introduce charging tariffs for EVs, for example. All of that can combine to mitigate the worst impacts of some of these areas.
Thank you, Steve. Joel, I'll come to you around heat pumps. So there's a question from Debbie here. As there is a focus for new builds on installing heat pumps, and heat pumps are still an expensive technology, it is likely that this will reduce other things provided through developments such as affordable housing. So there's a question here, is there any movement for grants that could be provided to help developers or registered providers cope with significant costs coming through development? So is that something that we're taking into account in terms of heat pumps as an expensive technology, our focus on new builds? Is there anything sort of within the methodology that sort of touches on that as a high upfront cost consideration?
I think the way that comes through in the model, and it's a relatively boring answer, is that that's captured within the scenarios, that some scenarios see higher uptake of heat pumps in social housing, and some scenarios would see less heat pumps in social housing. I think the wider answer is it's beyond my pay grade and more likely down to individual councils, local authorities. Social housing would welcome views from other panelists and anyone else as well. But yeah, interesting, how you prioritize different objectives for social housing, how you prioritize economic versus environmental versus capital expenditure versus long-term running costs, and what your own priorities are for different social housing providers within that.
Thanks, Joel. I'd just like to address another one to you as well, if that's all right. So how have the recent gas and fuel spikes and IFA issues affected the scenarios in terms of resilience in the network and our EV rollout modeling in the near term?
Yeah, interesting one. I think it's something that we need to think about more widely, but again, that there's a boring answer here, which is that to an extent we would hope that that would be captured within the scenarios. In particular, the net zero scenarios have extraordinarily rapid uptake of EVs. By the late 2020s, in those in the most ambitious scenarios, you've got essentially all vehicles being sold, all cars being sold are battery electric. There's not even hybrids in the more ambitious scenarios. So obviously the approach to that point in the late 2020s results in extremely rapid increase in EV sales, and that gets into wider questions as to whether manufacturers will be able to keep up, whether the energy system will be able to keep up, and whether there's consumer appetite for that. I guess the greater impact is in the near term, and so we will be ensuring over the course of this project that the current spike in EV sales is reflected in the near term for all scenarios, really. But yeah, how that plays out over the next several years will be something we need to think about more closely.
Thank you, Joel. It is interesting seeing things like that unfold and appear in the news to sort of directly affect what we're considering in technologies in the next few years. So yeah, the team is obviously very tuned in to things as they unfold. So there's a question from Bill, who's from the Winchester Action on Climate Change organization. Can you publish versions of your maps of potential sites for solar, wind, etc., disaggregated to district scale, either in DFES or on request? So I think in terms of the output that we produce, some of those maps are part of the report that we produce. So where the pipeline sites are and where the wind resource availability is, we do include some maps, and we're happy to do that again this year for the 2021 reports. But I guess, Steve, is that something that we would, the SSEN would look to sort of make available more formally? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, within the DFES, we've always made the data that underpins that available on request. So the energy supply areas that kind of form the heart of the DFES, which are the kind of footprint around the substations that a substation influences. Those ESAs are separated out according to local authority areas. So we can provide local authorities and or local enterprise partnerships at a higher level subset of the data for their area. The only issue that we have at the moment is that most people are working from home. That data is significant, so trying to transmit it at the moment on laptops is more difficult. So what we're trying to do is we're working on a visualization on our website so that you can put in a postcode or a local authority title, which will give you a visualization of the data and the ability to download the data behind it as well. That will be clearly a couple months away at the moment, but in terms of a subset of the data, we can arrange for that on request.
Great, thank you, Steve. So there's a question from Amanda. Some aspects of the 4 scenarios require definite choices to be made, i.e. whether or not hydrogen is used for domestic heating is a good example. Do you have a feel for when one scenario has to be picked from the 4 pathway options? So yes, come back to you, Steve, on that one. I mean, is it worth touching on the best view type analysis and what you look at for the business plans, etc.?
Yeah, so in terms of the best view, like I said, we've taken the kind of community transformation view. We have updated that for certain areas. So, for example, in Scotland, where we've got clear policy directives from Scottish Government around net zero by 2045, and more challenging targets around 2030 as well. We've incorporated that into the DFES because we can clearly see that that is a clear policy decision that is funded, and they have the ability to deliver on that. In terms of our local authority engagement, we'll apply the same criteria in that if a council, for example, has a climate emergency or document, or strategic vision, if that's funded and we've got got evidence that gives us confidence about the ability of that council to deliver that, and that's clearly built into their future, then we can adjust our best view accordingly, so we can adapt that community transformation scenario to take that into account. So that's how we're going to work going forward. And clearly we're kind of scanning policy changes from government and BEIS and Ofgem as well. So the recent announcements on numbers of heat pumps and that sort of thing, that's fed back into the DFES as well, and we work with Regen to accommodate those changes as well.
Thank you, Steve. So there's a question, I think we might have to make this the last one. So from Cara, South Somerset, will SSEN and Regen help local authorities with their local area energy plans to identify suitable locations for solar, wind, etc., and energy storage? I guess the analysis that we're doing is something that we're obviously really keen to share and get into the detail of. Regen, obviously, as an organisation separately, we have worked with local authorities for many years on resource assessments for their local area, and we have a local authority membership package that we also offer, and we have members of the team headed up by my colleague Poppy Maltby, who we'd be more than happy to speak to South Somerset or any other local authorities who would like to talk about and do some more work in terms of the potential for renewables and storage in their area. And Steve, I'm sure you're happy to sort of say similar, that SSEN is happy to talk more about the potential in their area.
Yeah, definitely. I think we already work with local authorities. I think we've tended to keep it at a local authority level or LEP level, because we do have approximately 70 local authorities in our licence areas. So if we're kind of supporting every local strategy, that's a significant undertaking. But we have worked with, for example, Dorset LEP and Oxford LEP, for example, to kind of input into those plans and support. And our key input is the DFES for their areas, so that gives them insight in terms of what we're likely to see.
Great. Well, many thanks everyone, and for the guys on screen for wading into some questions there. Quite a few we got through. I'm afraid we didn't get through all of them. But we will take those away and see if we can come back with some responses after the call. It leaves me to say thanks very much for engaging in the process, for all of your input and your responses to our questions, and for those interesting questions as well. This is obviously the start of the analysis for us this year, and any other thoughts you want to share, please do get in touch. And thanks very much for your time, and I wish you all a good day.
That's great.